This is the logo of my friend Tom Shadyak's company, Shady Acres. This whole movie was Tom's idea when he called me after he had read an article about happiness and said that we should explore the causes of happiness in a documentary film. That call changed my life. This is my logo, which I made with a Sharpie marker, and my friend Ian colored it in and animated it for us. This opening quote I love from Benjamin Franklin is slightly misleading because it's actually the Declaration of Independence that promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the Constitution, it's slightly different. It says life, liberty, and property. The first days that I shot for this film were on the streets of New York City a few days before Christmas, because it struck me that although most people I know, when you ask them what do you really want out of life, they say they just want to be happy. And if you ask somebody what they want for their kids, they would say the same thing. I just want my kids to be happy. Yet we spend so much time and so much effort pursuing other things. You know, we work hard to get paid well to buy things that may or may not relate to our happiness. The film is narrated by Marcy Shimoff, who wrote a wonderful book called Happy for No Reason, which is one of the most popular books ever written about happiness. Now, here we are in Calcutta, India. I went there following a man who's known as the Indiana Jones of happiness research, because he goes to far-flung places around the world to collect data about happiness. While much data is collected on college campuses, Robert Biswas Diener goes to places like the Serengeti in Africa and to Greenland. He goes to places like the jungles of South America, and in this case to a very poor part of Calcutta, India, to collect data amongst people who are at the bottom end of the socioeconomic totem pole. And we followed Robert around for a couple of days, and we saw him collecting data, which is an interesting process where you not only ask an individual how happy they feel on a scale of 1 to 10, and you give them a bunch of tests, and you sort of analyze that data, but you also ask their relatives, you ask their friends or their husband or wife, how happy do you think this person is? And in general, the responses tend to corroborate. If you think you're a happy person, it's pretty likely that your friends and your family will think you're a happy person. One reason why Manoj is in the film is I was really struck by the power of his perspective, that despite the fact that he gets soaked with rain and he's pulling somebody through the crowded, polluted streets of Calcutta, India, he's still able to look to a brighter future, even if that future is maybe 15 or 20 minutes away when he's going to dry off from being soaked by a monsoon rain, or maybe a few hours away where he's able to look forward to coming home to see his children. That ability to see a brighter future and to have hope is a skill that many of the happy people I met making this film all shared.
সকালবেলা ফিরি যখন ওরা বসে থাকে ওই চার দোকান সামনেই ওরা যখন মানে তাকায় রাস্তার দিকে যে বাবা এই আসবে তখন ওদেরও মন ভালো লাগে প্লাস আমাকে যখন বাবা বলে ডাকে আমার মনটা আরো খুব
Some people would look at Manoj's community and say, you know, this is a slum, it's filthy, there's open sewage, there are animals running around eating garbage. It's a place you would never want to live. On the other hand, the community that I saw there, the bond which people shared, was stronger and more beautiful and more nurturing than I experienced in almost any neighborhood I've ever lived in. One thing I really wanted to do with this film is to explore this relatively new field of science called positive psychology that I had not heard of until Tom suggested we make the movie. But once I discovered it, it seemed like something really fascinating, that just to learn that for so many years we had studied depression and psychological illness, but that the other end of the spectrum really had not been studied in a very rigorous scientific way.
But one that flourishes with a deep and genuine happiness.
One of the first interviews we did was with Ed Diener, who many people feel is the founding father or the godfather of the field of happiness research or positive psychology, because of how long he's been collecting this data and investigating what really makes us happy.
Which they were all doing, but you couldn't measure happiness.
And many of the scientific papers that are written about happiness are based on the research that Ed and his colleagues have done. I realized pretty quickly in the process of making this film that there are very few people, and I didn't meet any sort of demographic group of people anywhere in any country I went to that was not interested at some level in happiness.
Every week for a happiness class.
The first thing is to realize that happiness can actually help you get your other...
What Ed just said there is really one of the fundamental premises of the film, that happiness is not just a byproduct of doing things that you enjoy or that give you pleasure, but that happiness can have a huge impact on enabling you to achieve the goals that you want to achieve in life. The man there with the clipboard is Robert Biswas Diener, known as the Indiana Jones of happiness research, because he goes around the world to collect data in places where nobody else will. And he is the son of Ed Diener, who we see here.
Say, gee, what really matters?
By studying identical twins, people with almost exactly the same genetic makeup.
When I started making this film, I thought that a huge component of happiness was your genetic makeup. You know, either you inherited kind of happy genes and you tend to look at the bright side and make the most out of life, or you were a grumpy person who, you know, even when things are going well, you have a tough time being happy. And that's true to some extent, but I had no idea how much of our happiness really is within our control. And it doesn't mean that everyone can be happy all the time, and we don't even necessarily want to be happy all the time. But it does mean that for most of us, most of the time, we can increase our happiness. When we were looking for a font to use in the graphics, I searched. I literally looked at a couple thousand fonts, and for some bizarre reason, ended up settling on my own handwriting. So that little chicken scratch is my handwriting that I made into a font on a website for $5. For people who live in Southern California, a lot of this footage might be very familiar. We shot it on the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, and this is actually Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Shot a little bit everywhere. That's on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. I love this idea that even doing something so small as driving a different way home from work, or maybe taking a different mode of transportation to work, can give us a boost in our happiness. One of the many highlights of making this film for me was being able to spend a few days with Roy Blanchard and his family in the bayou in Louisiana. The way that we found Roy is really a sort of a telltale story of how we made the film, which is that a wonderful woman who I had never met emailed me randomly to tell me that she appreciated my first movie, Genghis Blues. Her name is Lisa Millimet, and she wrote to me to ask what I was working on next. And when I told her, she said that she had won a competition photographing happiness in the South. And so I immediately wrote her back, because we were at the stage where we were trying to find people to be in the film. And I asked her who did she photograph, because maybe we should interview them for our movie. And she gave me a list of names, and a couple months later I was floating down the bayou, shooting one of the most amazing sunsets I've ever experienced.
Sometimes I'm kind of like down a little bit. I jump on my four-wheeler and I come park right there.
One of my favorite things about making documentary films is you end up learning things about people that you otherwise may never have learned, because you can ask them questions you might not ever otherwise ask. The Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana is so incredibly beautiful. It almost felt like we were in Jurassic Park or something, with this incredible wildlife. And it's such a stark reminder of how we as people are just such a small part of this amazing ecosystem that is our Earth.
You don't know what you're going to see, but nature, especially like this, you know, it's good medicine.
I'm really interested in the science of the study of happiness, because it's one thing to have an opinion on what will make people happy, but it's another to find physical or physiological evidence that can help us understand the way happiness works.
That's necessary for feelings of pleasure.
This is one of those parts of the movie where, as a filmmaker, I have to really find the balance between this being an educational piece and informative, and being a work of art that is engaging and entertaining. I love the science and can listen to it all day long, but some people prefer the stories that we tell in the movie.
Teenage years onward, you're slowly losing dopamine synapses and probably dopamine neurons as well. As far as we know, no one's observed those regenerating. If it's too severe, then you end up with Parkinson's disease.
This totally blew me away that one of the physiological components of happiness also plays a role in Parkinson's disease. That when this physiological component, the dopamine system, is healthy, we are active and we have a high sense of well-being and we're happy. And when that dopamine system is extremely unhealthy and it's deteriorating, we can experience unhappiness and even depression, and at the same time a lack of motor skills. So our ability to move and be active is at some level linked to our ability to be happy. I want to touch on again just what we were talking about in terms of mobility and happiness. If somebody is inactive or they're paralyzed from the neck down or they have limited mobility, it doesn't mean that you can't be happy in that state, but it does mean that there's some correlation between physical exercise and our happiness.
I like banana splits, I like banana peels, I like big bananas.
The brain is
I had a great time with Greg and Reed. They've been good friends for a long time, and they're experts in happiness, and we laughed a lot that day. While I was making this film with one of my best friends who produced it, Eiji Han Shimizu, we started surfing again. I hadn't surfed in about 10 or 12 years, but after hearing how important physical aerobic exercise was, we decided to start prioritizing surfing in our lives again. And we noticed that every time we stopped at the surf shop, the guys who worked there were so genuinely happy. They seemed mellow and unstressed, and they were really helpful, and they were fun. And because so many surfers say that it is the thing in their lives that gives them so much joy, and it sort of calibrates everything about their life. So I really wanted to put a segment in about surfing. And we discovered that in Brazil, there's a small town that's sort of founded around surfing. And we called the local surf club there in Itacaré, Brazil. And we asked them, who should we interview for our film? And we told them what it was about. And they all agreed that we have to talk to Ronaldo Fadul, because he's one of the first surfers ever to ride waves in this area. And he's been there ever since. Fadul is an interesting character because he fishes for a living, so he makes money for a few months out of every year, which enables him to surf and spend time with his family for the rest of the year. And one year he said he had a good catch, and so he bought a piece of land that has a sign out front that says Fadul's Place. And it's big enough that about 6 or 7 of his friends have built houses on this piece of land. So all around this house where Fadul lives, he has a group of his friends that he sees every single day. Many of us think that it's impossible to live near our friends because we have jobs or careers or whatever that gets in the way. But Fadul is a great example of somebody who, with very limited resources, has made it work. We had this great idea when we knew we were going to go to Brazil to shoot, that we would spend a week working and we would stay for an extra week just to hang out and surf and experience Brazil. And I don't know if we're workaholics or what, but we only surfed 2 days, and the rest of the time we were finding amazing people and places to shoot.
Para que eles nunca digam que eu não fiz o que eles gostaram de ser. Se ele quiser ser surfista, ele vai ser. Se ele quiser ser doutor, ele vai ser.
Fadul took us to some of the most amazing beaches I've ever been to. This is one of my favorite shots of him walking on this beach. I believe it's called Engenhoca. And you take an incredible half-hour walk through a pristine jungle to get to the coastline, and then take a left and walk along a ridge for another 10 minutes. And you get to this isolated, beautiful, pristine beach with some perfect waves. We got this rock climbing footage from Lincoln Else, and I still don't know how Lincoln shot this. I don't know if he was hanging over a cliff or if he had his camera dangling off the end of a tripod or what. This is a perfect example of how this movie changed my life, because Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi dedicated decades of his life to studying something that I had always just taken for granted, being immersed in something and being totally absorbed by an activity. Before I had heard about flow and Csikszentmihalyi's work, I had no idea of how significant that experience is.
See it happening and you feel that nothing else matters.
And you see here is named Mark Adler, who is the composer of most of the music in this film. When I was a kid, I had an idea that if I ever made a movie, I should do all of it. I should shoot it and write it and direct it and compose the music and play the music and everything. I didn't understand how people could have somebody else do something so important on a project that they were calling their work of art. By now, of course, I realize how lucky I am to have talented people like Mark Adler working on my movie.
Kind of ego that we are all.
This was shot just off of Glencoe Beach in the suburbs of Chicago, just along the north shore of Lake Michigan. And that's George Matavul, one of our dad's best friends.
Flow can happen almost anywhere. It can happen during personal time, or it can happen
While
with
we were in
family.
Louisiana shooting the segment on Roy Blanchard and his family, we stopped in at a Waffle House restaurant just to take a break. And when we walked in, we immediately were struck with how happy the place seemed and how kind the staff was and how the staff was laughing and having such a great time with each other. They were clearly good friends. And we decided then and there we had to shoot something in this Waffle House. And we came back a couple hours later with our cameras and spent about 4 hours in the restaurant. It was a great example of how a workplace can be absolutely transformed by the spirit and the attitude of the employees.
Causes and sources of happiness simply isn't true.
Not long after we started making Happy, did we discover that Daniel Gilbert, who had just written a book called Stumbling on Happiness, would be speaking at a local bookstore in San Francisco. So we went to the bookstore with our cameras. The audience was just totally enraptured with Dan's presentation. He has such a deep understanding of positive psychology, and at the same time he's able to articulate these ideas in such a clear, concise, and entertaining way. He's a great asset to the film.
People do really good when things go really bad. Sounds like a country song, but it actually turns out to be true.
The way we found Melissa Moody for the film is that I met a man through a friend. I met a guy named Lawrence Shorter who was writing a book on optimism. And optimism and happiness kind of go hand in hand. And we had a great meeting, and at the end of a couple hours, he apologized that he had to go. He had to interview somebody for his book. And he said, you know, we had such a good time together. He said, why don't you just join me for the interview? And for the next hour or two, I got to hear Melissa Moody tell her amazing story. And at the end of it, I asked her if she wouldn't mind appearing in the film. And I think the movie wouldn't be what it is without her story.
Genuinely good mother all my life.
I was very, very busy.
When figuring out how to tell a story like Melissa's on screen, one thing I tend to want to do is set up the sort of normal version of things, set up what you would expect. So we talk about her background and what she did so we can relate to her as a character. And then when we get into the nuances of her personal experience, hopefully we've already bonded with her as a person.
I was in shock. My whole life changed instantaneously. It was the 4th of July on my family ranch in Texas.
After hearing Melissa's story, I knew it was really important that we get it right in the film and tell it with the power and intensity with which I felt it the first time I heard it. And there's a lot of pressure there. As a filmmaker, you have to figure out how you're going to shoot it and what kind of music you're going to add. And what ended up happening is I shot it very, very simply. I just turned the camera on and let Melissa tell her story.
And so I got out, and I guess it was right here, actually, where the truck was. And we were having a disagreement. Wow. She drove off in a hurry, and when she did, my hand was on the door handle. I was running alongside trying to get my hand
I've often thought that in documentary filmmaking you have an advantage, a kind of advantage over fiction filmmaking, because the intensity of a story is amplified by the fact that you know it's true. And this is one of those cases for me.
the gravel to try and get away, and I couldn't. And it went over up my spine and over my head and crushed my face in the rocks.
Melissa's story for me is one of those rare stories that is so powerful. It makes me realize that most of the things I worry about and I'm consumed by are really irrelevant in the grand scheme of things and are really small, and that there's so much to be grateful for every day. When I mentioned to some of my friends that in the movie we interviewed a woman who was run over by a truck, they asked, what does that have to do with happiness? And I think it's important to that if we're really going to try and understand happiness, we have to face the fact that none of us can avoid suffering for our whole lives. And I thought Melissa's story was a perfect way to explore that.
Very traumatic for him too, but for 9.5 years, I was totally
I
disabled.
think one of Melissa Moody's most charming and successful qualities as a person is her ability to see the humor in things. And her front teeth are false. And when she described her reaction to them the first time she saw them, she said they're bigger than her old teeth were, and she calls them her squirrel teeth. And she said her hair was straight before the accident. One part of Melissa's story that we couldn't put in the film is that she works with a gentleman named Mary Schneider, who was born blind and actually trained himself, healed himself, and taught himself to see again. An absolutely remarkable story. He runs a healing clinic where Melissa went to improve her own eyesight and was so moved by her experience there that she ended up working there. It's called the School of Self-Healing in San Francisco. And that's where this interview was shot.
Killing myself. I would buy myself time, say, well,
The main guiding force in the editing process for me is the emotion of the story. And so my goal in editing is to try and create the widest gap, the broadest amplitude between, to put it simply, the happiest part of the movie and the saddest part of the movie should be as extreme and as different as possible. In just about every movie I've made, that the very simple principle is something I use in the editing room. And of course, Melissa gave us one end of the spectrum. And on the flip side, one of the best parts about making a movie like this is I get to actually go to these places and meet these amazing people. And Melissa invited me to her family ranch. We spent a day with her family and one of her sons, Jamie, and I got to see the horses that she raised. Beautiful, beautiful place to be. Melissa introduced me to Hap a few months after we shot her sequence, and he reminded me of how important our support teams are. You know, Melissa wouldn't have been able to recover the way she did without the love and support from her family. It reminded me of a phrase that I love, which is that we're all in this together, because we really are.
His name is Happy, and we have a wonderful life together.
After Melissa told me this incredible story of her journey, then she says her new husband is named Happy. It's one of those moments in filmmaking where you just go, oh my God, this is meant to be.
Person, I am more grounded, more centered, more connected and integrated with who I am, and grateful for
This is really the part of Melissa's story that made me realize that I had to tell her story in our film, which is that after all of this hardship that she's experienced, that she's actually happier now than she was before. That just kind of blew me away, and still, that still sticks with me.
Oh, this is fun. I haven't just stood out in the rain in quite a while.
For some reason, I love birds, and in Genghis Blues, my first movie, I had a bunch of shots of birds, and my friend was laughing at me saying there's way too many bird shots, but there's something about watching them fly that's just lets my mind wander.
There's a general lay sense that all adversity is bad.
One thing I started to notice as the production went on is how many people who were studying emotion and happiness were actually happy people themselves. And Richard Davidson is a great example of somebody who loves his work and is very fulfilled by it, and is just a great guy.
To adversity. They do. They show
These animations that appear throughout the movie were done by my dad's cousin named Relija Penezic, and some of the work was done by his colleagues in Serbia. I wanted the style of the animations to feel organic and kind of imperfect and textural, because the quality of high-definition video is so crisp and clear. Sometimes it feels too sterile, and so I wanted the animations to feel a little bit more earthy and handmade. Here's another example of how an independent film really is not made independently, that you actually depend on so many people to get involved, including, in this case, a person I just met on the street, and he was willing to take some time out of his day to become part of this process.
We're told in our society that the way to be a competent person, the way to be
In our second round of interviews, I went to Illinois with my producing partner Francis Reed and A.G. Han Shimizu to interview Tim Kasser here at Knox College. The way that we found Tim is that he wrote a book called The High Price of Materialism, and that's the way really we met a lot of the scientists, is that we read about the work they did or the books they've written, and then it was up to Francis Reed to cold call and see if they would agree to do interviews. And many of them, like Dan Gilbert here, get approached constantly to do interviews and to participate in other projects. And we were very fortunate that everyone we wanted to speak with was able and willing to give us their time. I generally don't work with animations or graphics in my movies, and this was a really fun challenge to see if we could use the animations to help explain some of the ideas in a very, very succinct way, in a kind of poignant and visceral way. And one of my favorite animations is this one right here about the hedonic treadmill. I think it just says just what it's supposed to say.
That's what the hedonic treadmill is.
That hedonic adaptation is one of the main enemies of happiness.
This is the only part in the movie where we came back to the same character a second time, but Roy Blanchard hanging out with him and his family was such, it had such an impact on me, because they live so differently than so many people I know, in the sense that they actually see each other all the time. They're a family that functions well. They play together, they're exploring the bayou, they cook, and it felt like half the time we were there they were laughing at something or someone.
In English, somebody tell you something and you didn't understand it, you say, could you please repeat that again? I didn't understand it. In French, you say, ah. That's your
Roy Blanchard is a master storyteller, and in the film we see him only speaking briefly, but he told me some of the funniest stories of hunting alligators when he was an 11-year-old kid in the bayou, and going out at 3 in the morning into the swamps on a tiny little boat called a pirogue to just see what they could find, and hearing strange noises and getting lost. And he went hunting once in winter and fell out of his hide onto something they call cypress knees, these really sharp remnants of trees that stick up out of the swamp, and he punctured his lungs, and he was there for 8 hours and thought he was going to die until his son came looking for him, and he barely survived. And as Roy told me these stories, it felt like there were gems slipping through my fingers. I just thought people need to hear these stories. So although they're not in our film, Roy agreed to talk, to just tell me stories for about 3 hours one day. I thought even just for his grandchildren, these need to be preserved. And at some point, we'll figure out a way to make them available either on our website or on another DVD or somehow. There's a very tragic story that the Blanchard family also experienced, which is the murder of their father. He was a very well-respected and loved figure in the community, and so the loss was felt by everyone in that area. Ed Diener here is often referred to as Dr. Happiness because of how long he's been studying happiness and well-being. He said he made up the term well-being because it was more scientific, and nobody would take him seriously when he said he wanted to study happiness. So the term subjective well-being was created. And now that term is still used in scientific papers.
Two main kinds of goals or values which people might pursue in life: intrinsic goals and extrinsic goals.
Ed said that when he was in college, he told his professor that he wanted to do a paper about happiness, and his professor told him it was unscientific and it was unstudyable, and he can't do that for his thesis. And so Ed ended up doing his thesis on conformity, which I think is hilarious. And after he got out of school, then he went on to study the happiness of the farmers that he grew up near in California, because he said he noticed that although they were at the bottom end of the socioeconomic totem pole, they were among the happiest people he'd ever met. And so he wanted to study that. He thought there was something valuable in that. But at the time, nobody saw the potential that he saw in that direction of research.
Connected relationships with like friends and my loved ones. And then community feeling, which is having a sense of wanting to help the world to be a better place. We found that
this research was fascinating to me, that what we care about has a huge impact on our happiness. The topic of how important money is in terms of people's happiness is something that so many people are interested in. And there's one concept that once you have your basic needs met, more money doesn't bring you more happiness. But basic needs are different for different people. And in a city in Japan, it means one thing, and maybe on a farm in America, it means another thing. I wanted to see what it meant at the most fundamental level. And in fact, later on in the film, I went to Namibia because I wanted to see what made us happy when our basic needs meant a grass hut and a bow and arrow. One of the reasons why we shot part of the film in Japan is that my producing partner, Eiji, is from Japan, and he told me about karoshi, where people are dying from overwork. And he said it's something that's really increasing, and there's more and more stress in Japan, so he really wanted to cover that in our film. And so in this case, we were standing in this main square for hours trying to find somebody who would let us interview them. And Eiji had thought it would be really easy, and literally 2 hours later he was exhausted and frustrated, and finally we got one guy to talk to us. And I, of course, didn't understand what he was saying, but when Eiji translated it, it was the perfect interview that you see here that really articulates how people's values have shifted away from their personal relationships and their families and are focusing more and more to an extreme degree on their jobs. And I love this transition because it does so purely what film is good at, which is it juxtaposes two things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see side by side. And seeing that old shot of Japan just devastated, dissolving into this new urban mecca is for me just awesome.
A telling and dangerous phenomenon is occurring in Japan. People are working such long hours and enduring so much stress that they are literally working themselves to death. It's become so common, so many people have died, that they even have a word for it, karoshi.
This shot was given to me by my friend Craig McCurry, who goes around the world and shoots stop motion picture, film, and video. I think it matches perfectly with these images that we shot ourselves. After we got on the first train, I suddenly noticed that just about everybody on the train car was asleep or was trying to sleep, even the people who were standing up. And I asked Eiji what was going on, and he said, well, people just are working so hard, they get home late and they wake up early. And it was kind of shocking to me to realize that it's not just a few people, but it seemed to be almost ubiquitous. This is one of the many, many, many edits that I love that our editor Vivian Hillgrove made, where when Hiroko is talking about the sound of the term eliminate waste, we actually hear a beautiful sound where she hits this little gong. This for me is one of the most powerful sequences in the movie and was shot without me being there. It was shot by my producer Eiji and cameraman that he found in Japan. This may sound a bit weird, but I didn't realize how cute kids are until we had our first baby about 9 months ago. And we got this footage and edited the scene many, many years before I had a child. Now I realize how much more powerful it is for just about anybody who has kids, because you immediately empathize at a deeper level than you might otherwise. This scene absolutely blew me away. We got some home footage from Hiroko, footage of her and her husband before he passed away. And when we came across this bit where we realized that his own daughter did not recognize him after he had been away on yet another business trip, it was just devastating to me, and I knew we had to put it in the film. It's such a clear sign that Kenichi's work life had just taken over way too much. It's a theme that we struggle with even on our happy team, because there's so much work to do and so little time to do it in. It's rare that I've come across somebody who has such powerful home footage to contribute to a documentary I'm working on, but in this case, Hiroko had these hours and hours of tapes of her and her husband and her kids, and there's one shot that we didn't put in the film of Kenichi crouching down in the hallway of his home. Apparently he had just walked in the door from work, but he was so exhausted he literally couldn't stand up. He made it just into the front door and squatted, and apparently he was there for 10 or 15 minutes before he had the strength to get up and go to the bedroom and collapse. And it was in those times, Hiroko said that his daughter would come and want to play with him, and he was too exhausted even to stand up, so they would play in the hallway where he was crouching. And this footage was shot by my producing partner, AG. There's not much slow motion in this film, but this is a sequence where it just felt right. This image makes me feel that it looks like people are sort of marching willingly to their own death, which in a way we all are, so might as well enjoy it. A friend of mine saw the shot and said, "Oh, what a perfect shot. You know, you actually got the guy rubbing his eyes like he's so tired." And sometimes you have to wait hours to get the shot that you're looking for. And on the trains in Tokyo and Yokohama, anywhere you look, there were people who were just showing signs of extreme fatigue and overwork. And you know, some people who've seen the film have pointed out that it's not like this in all of Japan, and that's of course true. In our film, we sort of show two extremes. We show the extreme side of work life and the urban experience, and then we also go to the other extreme in Okinawa later in the film, where we see people who have found a way to flourish and live harmoniously. And of course, in Japan, just like in just about every other country, there is a spectrum. But as a storyteller, you're sort of forced to figure out what it is you want to say. What do you notice that you want to convey to people? And you put a magnifying glass on it. You have to choose what's poignant and what gets at the, as Werner Herzog calls it, the ecstatic truth. Herzog, as a filmmaker, has made something like 50 documentaries and fiction films in his career so far, and he says that what he tries to get at, whether he's making a documentary or a fiction film, is not an accountant's truth. It's not about facts and figures, but he wants to get at something more human, something deeper, which he calls the ecstatic truth, and I think that's a great way to express it.
We believe that this contentment, this happiness lies within the self, and there's no external source.
One thing I really love about the fact that Bhutan has this gross national happiness policy is that they're a country that most people in the West have never even heard of. And if they have, it's only because of this, because of what they're doing. So what that means is on the global scale, in the entire world, the one country that's inspiring us to look at things not only from an economic perspective, but in a holistic way, is this tiny country that otherwise many people would never know about. And I love the idea that a country and a people can contribute on the world stage in a way that's not just based on economy or technology. One decision we made when we were considering going to Bhutan for this film is we decided to hire a Bhutanese filmmaker instead. It was expensive for us to get there, and we thought it would be fun to collaborate with somebody who's lived there and who knows Bhutan more intimately than we do. So through a friend of a friend, we found a gentleman named Kaesang Finley who shot this beautiful footage and conducted this interview.
Bhutan must always be forest. In terms of culture, we have monasteries, we have schools to be protected by the state, we have rules on dress.
I also want to point out that Bhutan doesn't have it perfect yet, but I love that they're trying. I love that they're trying with, and their main inspiration is to create a holistically functioning, sustainable society, rather than simply relying on economic growth.
The people of Bhutan have only recently begun pursuing gross national happiness. And to know how successful they'll be, we'll have to wait and see. Another country in a different part of the world consistently ranks as the happiest country on earth. Denmark is known for its social equality and high standard of living. All Danes are provided free education through college and free health care for life. But Denmark's most unique and revealing quality is that it has more...
This sequence in Denmark was shot by my brother and by Eiji Shimizu, one of the producers of the film. We wanted to see if there's something about living together, if there's something about sharing responsibilities and sharing experiences like meals with people who are outside of your immediate family. I wanted to see if there's something about that might benefit happiness, because intuitively it just feels right. It's only the last couple hundred years at the most that people have been so insulated and have moved towards nuclear families. And traditionally, in almost every culture, there's a lot more interaction between extended families and neighbors, just because of the nature of the architecture and the nature of society and the cultures. In the West, we've become more and more insulated. And so when I learned that in Denmark they're doing something that sort of bucks that trend, where people who have resources, who have decent jobs, who are modern people and own cars and have technology, when they're choosing to live together, in a way it almost seems like they're stepping backwards. They're going to more traditional communal style living. They're not communes at all, by the way. People have their own space, they have their own things, but there's a lot of communal space, there's shared space. The people, as you can see in this film, definitely seem to benefit from those extended relationships.
It's a working piece.
One of the kids said something that's not in the film. She said that in the place she lives, she feels like she has 40 or 50 grandparents, and she has something like 70 brothers and sisters, because these kids end up growing up together and they form very tight bonds that last, apparently that last a long time after, even they go to college and move away. I love the fact that Anne here is talking about how small their place is, because one thing that just about everybody I know in America wants to do is have a bigger house, a bigger yard, sometimes bigger car, bigger everything. And I think there's some wisdom in the fact that this place in Denmark actually has small spaces, so that you end up going to the public space, the playground in the middle, or the cafeteria in the middle, where you end up seeing more people. I can't imagine a much better way to grow up as a kid.
We eat together, and it's very, very nice.
I love this scene because it shows the simplicity of what living together can be like. It simply means eating together and being with your friends when you're doing your chores. For me, one of the best things about going to school when I was younger is being able to spend time with my friends every single day. And it seems very strange to me that as we grow up and gain independence and we start driving our own cars and having our own places to live, we somehow move away from seeing our friends regularly. So I was excited to see how they figured it out in Denmark, where it's not something strange or bizarre. It's just normal people living normal lives, except they get to share more with each other.
What is the meal today? And to buy all the stuff and to make it and to do the dishwash. Every day it saves, I don't know, 2 hours and a lot of energy.
And this place, when we get 14, we have to make food.
So it's 2 girls and 14 cooking for 40, 50 people. It's really cool. And they come to us.
I love the simplicity of this idea that you cook once or twice a month. And it might take you a few hours, but you cook once or twice a month, you do the dishes once or twice a month, and then the rest of the month you get to eat the food that your neighbors and other people in your family are cooking. I can't help but think that the world would be a better place if more of us lived in communities where we had neighbors we could rely on and where we knew our kids were safe and happy.
They are kind of grandmother and grandfather for my children. I feel they love my children as much as I do, and they are happy when they visit them and they come here. And
although I wasn't in Denmark while the sequence was being shot, when my brother and AG brought the footage back and I started sifting through the footage, it was so obvious how harmonious this place was that they had been, because in almost every shot there was somebody smiling, and it seemed like people knew each other. And I kept asking, are they sisters, or is that his mom, or is that their dad? And they kept saying, no, that's their neighbor, that's their friend. And it looked like one big happy family.
I think when we work in a community,
some of this footage was shot at a place called Findhorn in northern Scotland. It's an amazing place. If you haven't heard about it, it was founded by a few people in the 60s who essentially got a piece of land that was not arable. It was cold and kind of miserable, but it's all they could afford, and they set up a few trailers. And one year they decided to try and plant something to see if it would grow, and everybody said, you're crazy, because the soil was terrible. And somehow over the course of the next few years, these gardens that they made were huge, and they were coming up with these huge cabbages and amazing vegetables, and a movement grew around this place, and it has evolved into what is Findhorn today. And people come from all over the world to take workshops and see what they've done there.
And one of the other things we know is that not all religious people are happy, or not all.
Although religion is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people, and politics are sensitive for people, I thought it was really important to include some of these perspectives that I completely disagree with, but that do exist in our society, and unfortunately lead to a lot of the events that we read about in the newspaper or see on TV, or in worst case scenario, experience personally.
There are certain conditions, according to Jewish law, under which non-Jews may live here. This doesn't apply to the Arabs. They don't fit the category. They have to get the hell out.
If you look at the very fundamentalist groups who believe that everybody else is going to hell but their group, they're not happy, or they're less happy than other people.
When I was told that happy people tend to live longer, I remembered reading the Guinness Book of World Records when I was a kid and discovering that many of the world's oldest people come from Japan, and in particular from Okinawa in southern Japan. So I thought, if happy people live longer, maybe these people who lived a long time are happy. At the time, we hadn't come across any research that explored that topic. But what we discovered is that it was amazingly true, that the people we met were just they seemed so happy, and they were friendly and kind and compassionate. So really one of my favorite places to visit during this entire journey. Amazingly, I found out despite that there are beaches everywhere, it is an island, or a series of islands. There's not much surf in Okinawa. We wanted to find the oldest person in the village to see what he or she had to say about happiness and about life and flourishing. And when we found her, she was 106 years old. She just had this great sense of humor, and we had a wonderful time with her. And a few minutes into our conversation, after making some jokes with my producing partner, A.G., she asked him to marry her. A.G. was, I think, 37 years old at the time. I could not believe that she was 106. Incredible. This woman took us out to her farm to show us what she did every day for a few hours. And I think she was 86 years old. At the time, my grandmother was also 86 years old. But my grandmother was barely able to kind of hobble around our backyard, our garden. And this woman was in better shape than most of my friends who were half her age. One thing I didn't expect to find in Okinawa that we did not put in the movie, is that in the evenings, people would get together and barbecue and drink. And it actually reminded me of my college, except that nobody was lighting a couch on fire. I went to a kind of a wild college. And rather than 20-year-old students, most of these people were in their 90s. But they were having just as good of a time as anybody I'd ever seen at a party. They were dancing and joking with each other and laughing. It was awesome.
The rule is that the band members must be between the ages of 20 and 30.
When we started editing the movie, I was trying to make categories of the footage so that we would, let's say, have a compassion section, or a section on exercise, or another one on flow, or a section on relationships. And the truth is, it was really hard to do it because so many of the places we shot showed examples of many of these concepts that are brought out by the happiness research. So, for example, in Okinawa, we see people in flow, we see them getting exercise, we see relationships.
Talk about the day at a local community center. And though now housed in a modern building, it's been a staple in Okinawan society as long as people there can remember.
Here in Okinawa, obviously, community is such a huge part of the success of the Okinawan people, as it is in Denmark. When this woman described the practice of mixing the ashes with the other villagers, it's something that still moves me just to think about that. And they told me about this word, Ichiribachode, which means the first time you meet your already brother and sister. What an amazing concept. I heard that and I thought, oh, it's so obvious why people here can flourish if that's one of the main tenets of their society. The Okinawans we met were extraordinarily happy compared to any other cross-section of a population I'd ever come across. And that's an achievement in itself. But to realize that the island was razed to the ground, was absolutely obliterated during World War II. This woman we met had lost her entire family. To think that they have come from such hardship, such trauma, to get to a place where they're laughing and giggling and having fun and dancing, and just an amazing testament to the power and resilience of people. This community center where this scene was shot was just a plain cement building, and there's probably 40 women in there, all having a good time, learning some origami and drinking tea. And they had this boom box that was kind of blasting this traditional Okinawan music. And once in a while, a couple of these people would just stand up and sort of start dancing this kind of hula dance. And I don't speak Japanese or the Okinawan dialect, and I don't like buying souvenirs usually. But I thought one thing I could bring back to America is this dance step, because it looked like so much fun. And so I asked one of the women to show me the dance step. And she looked confused, and Eiji was translating. And when she finally figured out what I was asking her, she said, "Oh, no, we don't have a dance step. There's the traditional dance step in Okinawa is to do whatever you want." I've been fortunate enough to go to about 50-some countries around the world, and I've never been to a place where the traditional dance step is freestyle. Usually when I'm done editing a movie, I feel like I put all the best stuff in, and everything that wasn't the best is not in the film. Often there are exceptions to that, and in this case, during this race of these children, there was a sequence I really wanted to put in. After the first child ran across the finish line, I went to congratulate his grandmother on having such a speedy grandchild, and she said, "Oh no, he's not my grandchild. My grandchildren are probably older than you." And I said, "Oh well, whose grandchild is that?" And she looked around at her friends. There was probably 15 or 16 grandmothers waiting at the finish line. And she looked at her friends and she looked at the kids and she said, "Oh, none of my friends are related to any of these kids." And I said, "Well, what are you guys doing here?" And she looked at me like I was crazy and she said, "Well, we're here because the kids are here." She said, "That's just what we do here. The kids were having a race, so we came to support them." What an amazing example of a healthy society, where you can show love and compassion to a stranger just because they're there. This is one of those parts of the movie where the balance of science and stories are hopefully right in line. I love that there's this kind of scientific backing of what we're getting out of this story of Okinawa. For about 9 years, I lived in a place in Northern California called Vallejo, and we became friends with a journalist there named Richard Friedman, who was very kind to write a few articles about the movies that my brother and I had made. And when I told him I was making a film on happiness, he said, "You have to meet Michael Pritchard. He's a good friend, but more importantly, he's amazing, and he teaches kids about happiness. You just have to see him." Eventually, we got a hold of Mike, and I went to see him do a presentation at a school. I was absolutely blown away at what he achieved, that he was able to get kids so comfortable and so open that they would talk about such sensitive issues as being picked on. And I thought, well, maybe this is a fluke. Maybe we should go see him do it again. Maybe he just got lucky. And so we went to another school, and in this case, the school in the film is Benicia Middle School, which is right next door to Vallejo. And we saw the same thing again. Michael had this extremely deep connection to the kids.
I love 8th grade boys on the phone. They go,
Since we shot Michael doing his presentation twice, I had this experience of editing the footage, and I noticed that there was a pattern, that for the first 15 minutes or so, Michael just tells jokes, and he gets the kids totally on his side, where they just love him and they think he's not like the most normal adults, because he's making them just crack up and he knows the lingo. And then after about 15 minutes, he starts to switch, and he kind of starts slipping in the good stuff, and starts really challenging them. And but by that point, they're on his side, they're on his team. And I thought, I'd never seen anybody do something like that, using comedic skill to initiate a conversation. Naturally, we're empathic beings, and so much of school is about social hierarchy and picking on each other and seeing who's tougher than who. And Michael gets beyond all that and somehow gets these kids in just one session to be able to break down those barriers and really talk about some of these most important issues. Ever since I saw Michael speak, I thought that every kid in America should be exposed to his presentation. At so many screenings of Happy, I've had teenage kids and even younger come up to me and say that they want Michael to speak at their school, because just about everyone understands what it's like to be picked on.
Here at Special Olympics, I have a little 11-year-old girl who's I'm coaching. Boom, the gun goes off and she takes off running. What a heart, what a spirit. And I hear kids say cruel things to her, but she's a good teacher. She takes off running, she goes, yes!
The story he tells about the girl at Special Olympics just still gets me. Michael has said to me many times that that teachings can come from the most unlikely places. People have come up to me at screenings who said they were in a school 20 years ago when Michael Pritchard came to speak, and they say they still remember vividly the presentation he gave and the impact it had on them and their friends.
Who turned and put her hand out for her friend. And then all 6 kids held hands and came across the finish line together, and she goes, wow! Together we all would win. Together we all would win.
About 25 years ago, Michael Pritchard was starting his career as an up-and-coming comedian, and he was working alongside people like Robin Williams and other comedians who were making a big name for themselves. And he had a contract in Hollywood and was making money, and he was in a few movies, and he was sort of on his way to stardom. And he told me that after a couple of years of being in Los Angeles and being in this sort of in a vibe that just was not very healthy, where people were more competitive than cooperative, and he felt people seemed to be out for their own interests at the expense of others. He thought there must be a different way to do it. And he did a presentation at a juvenile detention center. And the experience had such a profound impact on Michael that from then on he knew that he was going to use his comedy to affect positive change in the world. And so he's been doing presentations at schools and prisons and juvenile detention centers and all kinds of places ever since then. One of my goals is to facilitate some kind of a workshop where young comedians who are coming up can take a course with Michael to learn about how to use their comedic skills for positive change.
That's courage, guys. Who else can share?
Everybody knows I'm Joey. So I'm like the shortest kid inside this room. Nobody else is shorter than me. So everybody makes fun of me. They don't even know, man. It's not fair.
Stop a second now, Joe. Take a deep breath. How should we all treat each other? Come with the love now, buddy. Come with the love. Come with the love. How should we all treat each other, Joey?
We should just feel how they feel and tell them that ain't right. You shouldn't be doing that.
Give that a huge round of applause.
For a long time, I've been interested in other cultures and other ways of living. And so for this movie, I thought a perfect way to answer one of the deepest questions I had, which is what made us happy before our culture was created, before our societies were formed, before we have streets and cars and cell phones and computers. I realized there's a really effective way to answer that question. We don't have to go back in time because there are people who still carry the traditions of our ancient ancestors.
The best thing we can do for a child.
I knew that the sun of the Kalahari Desert would reveal something about our nature because they don't have the same distractions that we have in modern society. And one thing that really struck me as soon as I got there is how much humor there was, that people were laughing and giggling and joking around a lot. When I see pictures of traditional cultures sometimes, especially old pictures, oftentimes nobody's smiling or nobody's laughing, and you get an idea that this culture must be serious or depressed or they must be struggling. But what I saw among the Bushmen was exactly the opposite. I saw this group of people who was flourishing and joyful and
The
content.
broad strokes of their culture remain intact. They get much
When I got to the village, I was curious about who was the chief or who was in charge and how they governed each other. And I was told that traditionally in San culture there is no such a thing as a chief, and that every decision is made by group consensus, which is kind of incredible because you think as nomadic people, they face some really critical decisions sometimes, like when to move, when to migrate. Because if they migrate too soon, they could get to a place where there's no water, or maybe there's no animals, and they could be in a critical situation. And what they told me is that when somebody wants to move the village, he would propose it to the group. And if enough people seemed like they might go along with it, he or she would start packing up. And then other people would pack up. And if roughly more than half the group would go, then usually whoever's straggling behind would end up packing their stuff and go along. And if not enough people left with the initiator, then chances are he would just turn around and come back. I asked one of the men what was necessary for happiness. And he said, well, you need a few things. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, well, first of all, you need a blanket to be warm, and you need a bow and arrow. Sometimes when you're making a film, you just get lucky. This was one of those times. The first day that I arrived, I was told that there'd be a healing ceremony performed that night. It's something that happens only rarely. As the village was preparing, I noticed the men were pulling some things out of their huts, like something that looked like a bandolier, like a row of bullets, but they were actually cocoons. They were dried, hollowed out cocoons connected on a string. So there's a string of, let's say, 20 or 30 cocoons, and they were full of dried seeds. So what they were actually now had become, they were rattles. And the men would wrap these around their legs in a kind of spiral from their ankle up to their knee and tie them off on each leg so that when they danced, there's a sound of rattling, and that's what you hear in the movie right now.
My real guru to teach me the value of compassion is my mother. The first act after birth is relying on mother.
I absolutely love this part where the Dalai Lama mimics reaching for his mother's breast as a baby.
Just
I think that's awesome. Something so fundamental and something so universal.
Compassion. So the bond.
I heard a story from someone who was having an audience with the Dalai Lama with a group of other people. And somebody in the group asked the Dalai Lama, what was the happiest moment of your life? And without blinking, he said, right now. Right now.
These are there. Not only at the beginning, but the whole life.
Mathieu Ricard is this amazing combination of a man. He's a scientist. He has this degree in molecular biology, and at the same time he spent most of his life in a hermitage meditating in the Himalayas. So he has this kind of dual mind. He has the extreme Western scientific mind, and at the same time the Eastern spiritual or philosophical mind. Mathieu wrote a book with his father called The Monk and the Philosopher, and this book became a big success, and so a lot of money was generated from the sale of the book. And Mathieu, as a monk, didn't need the money, and he suddenly felt this responsibility to do something with this money that he was uninterested in, but it was there and he had to respond. And so he set up projects to build schools around the Himalayas for the local communities there. And Mathieu's now, the focus of his work is now about altruism and about sharing and acting with compassion.
So there's no obvious change in external behavior.
Richard Davidson has been studying emotion in the brain for over 30 or 35 years or so.
And all of a sudden, it's like, parts of the brain are on fire. These are areas of the brain which are extremely important for understanding happiness and well-being. And so we are, for example, currently doing studies where we are having people who've never meditated before, and we're having them do very simple exercises, 2 weeks of training in this simple compassion practice does change the brain in ways which are similar to, although not nearly as well defined as what we see in very long-term meditation practitioners. There is some evidence to indicate that we actually change the gross structure of the brain, literally the size of particular cortical areas in the brain change in their thickness. We, through intention, can change our brain.
Sonia Lyubomirsky was I believe the third person we interviewed for the film, and she had been a student of Ed Diener's, one of the first students of positive psychology, and she's gone on to do a research of her own and find a very prominent place in the world of positive psychology. And she not too long ago wrote a book called The How of Happiness, which is a great read and a very, very informative book.
On a regular basis. You know, they're going out and they're putting change in parking meters, and they're, you know, helping their friend with homework, or was visiting someone in the nursing home, or, you know, really doing real, you know, concrete behaviors. And it seems to me from our experience that the acts of kindness so far have been the most effective.
I've been to India a few times, and one thing that strikes me every time I go there is how incredibly beautiful the light is. There's always this kind of haze in the sky, so it feels like there's an orange or red sunset for half the day. There's a lot of dust and pollution in the air, and although that's not great to breathe, it makes for some beautiful pictures. The first time I heard about Andy Wimmer was through my friend Folko Terzani, who had spent about 7 or 8 months working in Mother Teresa's Home for the Dying. And that experience completely changed my friend's life. And he said that one person who really had an impact on him at the Home for the Dying was Andy Wimmer. So a couple years later, I was in India, and I had the great fortune of meeting Andy.
I was a bank and computer manager for many years, and a quite ambitious fellow. I wanted to become the youngest bank director there.
When our project about happiness came up, he immediately came into my mind as somebody we should approach to see if he would be in the film.
I used to waste a lot of money on fashion, for example. I was quite a fellow with quite, you know, into fashion and all these things. But it is not important anymore.
Andy has experienced the benefit of taking that risk of doing something that other people thought he was crazy to do. And he is among the happiest people I've ever met.
And that's it. It can't be. Life is such a precious and beautiful thing. There should be some more, you know.
I don't know many people who are not naturally compassionate or caring people. I know a lot of people who don't act that way, but deep inside, it seems like most of us want to do good things. Most of us want to have a positive impact. And Andy, I think, is an amazing example of somebody who has stepped beyond the normal bounds of what is expected of us to be a good citizen, and he has dedicated himself to the service of others. And even if I might never end up in the Home for the Dying, every time I see his story, I'm reminded that I could do just a little bit more than I'm doing now. I could at least do a little bit more. And I hope this movie can have an impact like that, at least if it affects some of us, at least a little bit. That's nudging us in the right direction.
It was like a flash, it was like a small enlightenment. You learn a lot from these patients, we care for. For example, accept.
One of the things about India that's so different from most of the places I've lived in America is that people's perspectives on death is very different. Death is something that's not turned away from in India. It's not uncommon to be driving down the street and see a body wrapped in a shroud on its way to being cremated.
Most important is to show them that they are loved by God, that they are not forgotten, that their life is precious, that someone cares. So we do everything by hand, but there is a tremendous sweetness in taking someone's burden up a little bit. Just to lift this little bent body and take that burden away a little bit and help him to carry it.
It's kind of funny to watch your own movie and still be inspired by parts of it. But I've seen this footage literally hundreds, if not thousands of times. And the stories of people like Melissa Moody and Andy Wimmer and Manoj Singh and Ronaldo Fadul, they still, every time I see them, they remind me that there are things I can do that would not only benefit me and my own happiness and my own well-being, but the people around me.
And I will give this loan back, but with interest. And that's what we do. You serve your brother in front of you who is in need, and it gives yourself a fulfilled, happy life. Perfect, no?
Gratitude, compassion, caring, love. These are, to me, what I would call spiritual emotions. And they make you think of things bigger than yourself. If you only seek your own happiness, it can be kind of a selfish thing. But once you move to the spiritual emotions and worry about the well-being of the world.
The footage of these women picking garbage out of the park, it was shot in Tyneside in Scotland. And my brother and AG shot that sequence with our friend Bruce.
By caring about these things that are bigger than yourself.
That's my girlfriend Gail at the dog park with somebody else's dog.
Each of us even spent a smidgen of time each day actually practicing to cultivate happiness and also to cultivate other virtuous qualities like compassion and altruism. The world would really be a better place, and we'd all be transforming our brains in very positive ways.
And it's not about, oh, I must change my life totally and cut off from my past and I'll be a better person. It's not about that. It's because the trick is to be authentically you.
I love this shot. It was taken in Tokyo. We were in a skyscraper looking out the window, and I saw this guy. And at first I didn't know what he's doing. When I realized he was tap dancing, I scrambled to get my camera because I love that spirit that somebody is willing in the middle of one of the biggest cities in the world is willing to climb up to the roof of his office building and take his break tap dancing.
Having new experiences.
In the course of making Happy, we shot over 400 hours of footage. And as you can imagine, since the film we finally made is less than an hour and a half long, there's a lot of footage that didn't make it in.
And with happiness, the more you have, the more everyone has.
When you direct a movie, people often give you the credit for making the movie, and it's true that I spent a lot of the last 6 years of my life working on this project, but it's also true that dozens of other people have spent an incredible amount of time also working on the film, including Eiji Shimizu, one of our producers, and Francis Reed, and Vivian Hillgrove, who did an amazing job editing the film, and Mark Adler, who composed the music for the film, Tom Shadyac, whose idea it was to make it, Ian Williamson, who put the DVD together. There's so many people, Kelly Ballinger and Omid Haydari and Bugs and Josh Fisher and Ben Flanagan, Pam Harris. So many people helped along the way, and so many more people that I didn't just mention. The thank you section of the credits is a testament to how many people have helped make this film. And to be honest, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's been a pretty incredible adventure to make this film, spend the last 6 years of my life doing it, but it's equally exciting to know that there are people out there who I haven't even met yet who are watching the film and sharing it with their friends and families and maybe getting something out of it. So thank you for being part of that journey. If you're still listening to this at the end of the movie, I'm totally amazed. I've just been rambling for almost an hour and a half. Well, thank you for your interest in the film, and I have a favor to ask you, which is help us spread the word about the movie. It's been awesome. And what is next? I have no idea.